Thank you, Your Eminence. I also wanted to acknowledge at this time Connie Contis. Connie, you want to stand up? Connie's been a member of our team, and she really took the lead in organizing this conference. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. Turns out we're both from Philly, so we have a lot in common. I think our parishes growing up were pretty much close, about an hour from each other, a little less. So it's good to have Father Luke here. Father Luke is director for the Missions Institute of Orthodox Christianity. He serves as a director for that institute, which is located at our seminary. He's an adjunct instructor at Holy Cross and Hellenic College, teaches class on missions and evangelism, and also parish leadership and formation. You have his bio, you can read the rest of that, but I wanted to point out that parish priest, has been parish priest for 18 years in Webster, Massachusetts. And when he arrived there 18 years ago, the parish was dying. And he said there was nobody younger than 40 in the parish. And now he has a vibrant parish with a lot of young adults, 30 of them, he said. Yeah. So that's really good stuff happening. Father Luke also spent 11 and a half years as a missionary, 10 of them in Albania and 1.5 in Africa. And so he has both kind of a foreign mission and domestic mission experience. So he seemed the ideal person to come and be our keynote. He and his wife have 4 children, and none of them married yet. Yeah. So please welcome Father Luke Veronis.
Your Eminence, thank you very much for inviting me and allowing me to be here. Your Grace, it brings back many memories when His Eminence was the Dean of Students, among other things, at Holy Cross. And I was a young seminarian and always inspired by His Eminence and His presence and all that he offered at this school. So thank you, Your Eminence. It's good to be here. And Father Jerry and Kenny and all of you, thank you very much. It's great to come and speak at a conference like this, Missions Evangelism Conference. I think since 1987 is when I first went to East Africa on the first mission trip that the Orthodox Church sent to outside of the United States. And from 1987, since then, I've been involved in going around speaking as a missionary, first when I was going to Africa, numerous places, mostly in East Africa, and then when my wife and I and 3 of my 4 children were raised in post-communist Albania, a fascinating time in the 1990s, and I'll share a little bit about that in my second talk, use some examples from the experiences there. But I've been blessed to be in the mission field and working under one of the greatest, or probably the greatest, Orthodox missionary in our generation, Archbishop Anastasios Yanulatos of Albania, a real spiritual mentor and guide and inspiration for me. And so I had that blessing. And then I came to New England back in 2005. And when I came in 2005, I think prior to 2005, some of you are from the Northwest. And I think the Northwest had the title as the most secular, non-religious part of the United States, up until around 20 years ago. And then after 20 years, in the last 20 years, the Northeast, New England, has become the most secular, non-religious region of the United States. And so I went from a country in Albania, the only country in the world that forbade any religion for 24 years. And I saw the resurrection of faith occur there throughout the early 1990s, and to the present time. And then I left there and I went to New England to be close to the seminary, and I went into the most non-religious region of the United States. And I actually got sent to a church, a small little church that I knew nothing about. And when I went there, once I got there, I discovered that I was the 43rd priest in its 85-year history. And that turnover of clergy could be seen in the congregation and what resulted. But since then, my wife and I, we've really seen this beautiful, vibrant renewal in the local parish that we're at. And so I love having this perspective of a cross-cultural mission, being in Albania and East Africa, but then also being here in America and realizing the needs in America. So my first talk in this keynote, Kenny asked me to give a foundation, a basis, the reason why we're called to be engaged in mission. And at first I said to Kenny, well, I don't know if I'm speaking at a mission and evangelism conference. Whoever's going to come to this conference must have an interest in missions and evangelism, so I don't think I need to convince them anything. But he said, no, I think we need to just begin the conference with this understanding of the mission imperative, to renew that, even for all of us. All my life, I've been involved and I've been interested, I've been excited about missions and evangelism, preaching the gospel, sharing the gospel, presenting it to people who don't know. But I also realize it's very easy to hit a plateau. It's very easy to accept the status quo. And sometimes we need to be re-inspired. So I think, and I hope and pray these next 3 days, we can set a foundation tonight, and then the book that we're going to be reading in the small groups, a lot of this retreat's going to be based on the small groups that we're going to break up into, discussing the book, spreading the word, and really talking about the concrete. What does it mean to be an evangelist? What does it mean to share the faith? What do we need to do in our parishes? And we're going to address a lot of that in the small groups. And then in my second talk, I'll give another vision of what can happen here in America. So I want to just begin tonight, though, going off with what His Eminence just mentioned. What's happening in the United States? And all of us know how our society is having this major shift in relation to religion and faith. We're a society that's confused and lost on many levels. We see a society that's turning away from organized religion and abandoning traditional faith. I think all of us know that and know plenty of people in our own families and friends who are lost. I mean, a couple years ago, I think in 2021, it was the first time in the history of the United States where the majority of Americans no longer belong, they're no longer members of any faith community. Only 47% of Americans are members of a faith community. And of course, we know the rise of the non-religious. So 1 out of 4 Americans don't identify with any religion. And if you look at the younger generation, the millennial generation, you have 40% of the millennial generation that don't identify with any religion. So what does that mean for the future of our church? These are serious, major challenges. And I often say, I teach a number of classes at the seminary, and I tell my young students who are preparing, they're these excited, zealous young students preparing to be priests, and I say to them, you have to be ready, because you're going out into a society and into churches that are very different than a generation ago. 80% of churches are declining in number, and many of them are dying. In New England, in the Greek metropolis of Boston, we have 66 churches, and probably 20 of those churches are on life support. 4 or 5 of them have closed down recently, and then another 20 are on life support. And then the other 30 out of 40 are struggling. That's the reality, but that's not unique to the Orthodox Church or to what's happening in New England. That's the reality of many churches in America. All of us know plenty of people who will say, okay, I'm no longer interested in organized religion, but I'm spiritual. I'm still spiritual. I'm spiritual, but not religious, which basically is a euphemism for saying I can create my own spirituality that validates what I already believe, that validates the lifestyle I want, and I get something out of it, but I don't want to be bothered with anyone telling me what to do. So, again, we have a society that's confused, right? They have little understanding of who they are. We're struggling with just understanding who the human person is. But then they're also confused or know nothing about who God is. So I've always encouraged, my wife and I've always encouraged our children to invite their friends to come to church. And so my children have taken us up on that, and they've invited a number of their friends to come to church. So my oldest son, when he was in high school, he invited one of his best friends to come to church. He came to the Anastasi service. So Pascha night, midnight, comes, attends the service. After the service, he comes to our house to break the fast. We're eating at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I see, after I come home from church, I see Ryan, and I say, Ryan, what'd you think of the church tonight? And he said, well, Mr. Veronis, he said, I'll be honest with you. That's only the second time in my life I've ever been inside of a church. And I said, really? So what'd you think about it? He said, well, I have to tell you, I learned something. I had never heard that Jesus rose from the dead. So I heard that tonight. Now, on one hand, that shocked me. But it didn't really shock me because this is what I teach at the seminary, and I know what's happening in our society. But to see someone, an 18-year-old young man, who can say he never heard in his life because his antenna doesn't listen. It's not that the message isn't out there, but in his world, he's never heard. Jesus rose from the dead, and he grew up only the second time in his life. So that was my son's best friend from high school. My son goes off to college. He brings one of his college friends to school, to church the next year. And he attends the Anastasi service. When I asked his friend Zach, so what'd you think about the service tonight? Zach said, well, I mean, it was interesting, but I didn't understand something. Why did you keep calling somebody a virgin? I mean, you don't typically go around saying Virgin Sue, Virgin Mary. And he said, who is the Virgin Mary? And I was like, really, you're a college student and you've never heard of who the Virgin Mary is? 2 examples that's simply anecdotes, but they reflect what's happening in our society. Albania was a country that I was a part of for 10 years where violently they persecuted, suppressed, destroyed every church, and didn't allow anyone to mention anything about God for 24 years. But here we are in America with the freedom of America where we're raising a whole generation of young people who know nothing about faith. So, I'm not saying this to lament the fact. That's our reality. The early church had a reality of being persecuted and being challenged in the Greco-Roman world. Our reality is 21st century America, a society that's turning away from God, a society that's confused. Okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, I have other stories to share that are a little different than Zach and Ryan, but I'm going to come back and share those stories a little later. So I think I could give a whole talk on what's happening in our society, but that was just a little introduction. My main focus is, okay, we who are the church, what are we doing? Or maybe we should begin by, who are we? When I became the priest of Saints Constantine and Helen in Webster, Massachusetts, Central Mass, 18 years ago, and I looked at the condition, the circumstance of the people there, I began my whole ministry there thinking that, okay, I'm not going to assume these people know anything, even though they've been lifelong members of the church. I'm not going to assume they understand what it means to be the church. Because I don't think many of our people, especially those who've grown up in the church and who are lifelong members of the church, I don't know if they know what it means to be the church and what the essence of the church is all about. So I could give a whole other talk about who we are as the church, but I'm just going to give a little brief summary. When we talk about the church, we're talking about a divine institution, the family of God. We're not simply another civic organization. We are a divine institution, the family of God. And we need to remember that. And we need to act like the family of God, like God's representatives. Like St. Paul says, we are ambassadors of Christ. We have to remember that. And that's first and foremost our identity. Not our Greek heritage, not any other type of identity we have. I grew up in a church in Lancaster, not too far from Father Jerry, and half the church was from the island of Kos, the other half was from the island of Chios, and they identified not as Greeks, but as Chiotis or Kotidas. Forget, we need to remember who we are as the church, this divine institution, the family of God. We are the presence of Christ, the body of Christ. And what Christ did, we need to be asking ourselves constantly, when we're reading the Gospels, what did Christ do? And what are we doing? And how are we continuing the work of Christ? That's the center of what it means to be the church. We can use a lot of different images. The lighthouse, that gives a light and direction to protect ships from wrecking on the shore. Or a life-saving station. I don't know how many of you remember or know the story of the life-saving station that would go out into the ocean to save shipwrecks, save the people. That's the job of the church, to be going out into the stormy waters. Yes, we live in this dark, confused society. Are we going into that society to try to help, to save people? The image of the church as an ark of salvation, bringing people into that ark to save them from the flood. Many of us know the image of the church as a hospital. And remember, a hospital, do they pick and choose who comes into them? The hospital receives everybody, whoever's sick. And it doesn't matter how sick you are. I often preach in my church. Our community, I say, we need to always be a family that welcomes everybody in our door. I don't care what you believe. I don't care what lifestyle you have. I don't care what mistakes you've made. You're welcome into our church. We're going to love you, respect you, and welcome you. Now, of course, if you come into our church and into our community, just like all of us, we welcome you into a journey of change, a journey of transformation. So none of us can stay the way we are. But where you're at, we'll meet you. And I don't care. I like the fact that in my church, I have one guy with tattoos all over himself, another guy with piercings all over himself. And they're two of my ecclesiarchs of my church. I want people to know, wherever you are, you're welcome. Because the church is this hospital to bring healing to all of us, and all of us are sick, starting with me. All of us are sick. And the other image of the church, which my old classmate, well, schoolmate, Aristotle Papanikolaou, came up with this beautiful image. He said, not only is the church a hospital and a saving station, he said the church is an artistic studio. He actually said it's a dance studio. I said, the church is a dance studio. But he says, it's a studio that teaches people how to dance, teaches people how to live, how to celebrate. So yes, it's a hospital, but it's a studio that brings life. So, think of the world where it's at and how troubled it is. And think of the church and who we claim to be. And this is what we claim to be, but are we? Are we living this out? So, what I want to focus on right now for this talk is to say, we can't just be content with where we are and keep our beautiful little church family and keep the doors closed. The essence of the church is our call to go into the world. Jesus said, not of the world, but in the world. You are the salt. You are the light. You are the yeast. That's not for itself. That's to go into society, to transform society, to invite society into the church. Father Thomas Hopka once said, if a parish has no awareness and consciousness of being sent by God to speak his words, to do his work, to accomplish his will, then it can't claim to be an Orthodox Christian parish. Do our parishes understand the idea that we are sent? Wherever we are, in my little town of Webster, my church of Saints Constantine and Helen, in my little town in central Massachusetts, there are a number of churches, and traditionally they're known as the Polish church, the French church, the Slavic church, and the Greek church. 3 of those churches are Catholic, and then the Greek church. And that's how they were founded, by those immigrants. But I always remind our church, yes, we were founded by Greeks and Albanians 100 years ago in Webster, but we are called to be sent into Webster. The big question that I always say, if your church would close its doors today, like some of the churches in New England are closing their doors, would the town and the people around even notice that you closed your doors? And if they did notice it, would it only be because, there's no more Greek festival? Is that all that they would notice? Because I think for many of our churches, that's all they would notice and all they would miss. And if that's all they miss, we're utterly failing as the church. Archbishop Anastasios of Albania says, a church without mission is a contradiction. Mission is the inner necessity for every faithful member and the church. If we refuse it, we're not simply refusing a duty, we're denying who we are. Because we are the apostolic church, the church that is sent out into the world. The way we evangelize, share our faith, and strive to accomplish mission, that's an expression of the vitality of the church. Don't tell me the vitality by your church building and by some social functions that you do. I don't care if your festival, I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We have a big Greek festival, and they have 20,000 people that go to the festival, and they make a couple $100,000. Great. But I don't care. That doesn't tell me about the vitality of your church. The vitality is, how do you reach out into society? And what you learn is the more you reach out, the more you're going to renew yourself. The more your community is going to be renewed. And that's what I saw in my little community in Webster. It was a very inward turned, closed, probably never did anything outside of itself type of a community. And now we're the exact opposite. But that's what's helped us to renew ourselves. Mission is in the DNA of the church. Yet how many of our own people don't understand this? How many of our churches don't live out this calling? And the big question is why? Why don't we understand that? Who can give me an answer? Why do you think? Why are our people and our churches not deeply engaged in sharing the faith?
Focusing on the non-essentials over the essentials.
Okay, so focusing on the non-essentials over the essentials.
Most of the culture is against it, so it makes it really awkward and hard to talk about it. I can give you an example. When I was still in university, I mentioned to God once in the classroom, and everyone reeled back in their seats. They were awed, they were aghast. The teacher said, no, so let's leave that out there. And I said, why?
Okay, so it's difficult. Our society's against us. Maybe we're afraid, maybe we're unsure because of the reaction we're going to get. So that's and these are the things that I think in our small groups we're going to talk about a little bit more.
Because of 500 years of Ottoman occupation.
So historically there's a reason. historically in our churches simply tried to survive over hundreds of years of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman occupation, decades of the communism, and historically that changed the whole idea of the early church being an apostolic, meaning a church, a people sent out into society. And historically, factors happen that change the mentality to simply a survival mentality. The whole society is aggressively against us, and we simply need to survive. And even though the Ottoman Empire ended in Greece 200 years ago, the mentality has continued, even to this day. Yes?
I think it's because of money.
Money.
Because, everyone, like parents will teach their children to become anything other than spiritual, and be in church, and to do other things to survive.
Yeah. So our priority isn't on preaching the gospel, sharing the gospel, and living our faith. It's on the American dream, making money and succeeding in different ways.
We also have a large proportion that are converts from Protestantism, and Protestants evangelize totally different. And so there's this thing that happens to you when you become Orthodox where you're not really sure how to do something. It's like
Yes.
this cloud that kind of you don't really get.
Right.
It takes a long time for Orthodoxy to like permeate you and to change you before you really feel like you can venture out.
Right.